Welcome to our last session of the day. And I have to tell you that I am really quite excited to share with you news that you'll learn about as part of this session. I want to welcome three of my colleagues to share in this next session. One of them you know very well, Barry Stein, who's the president and CEO of colorectal cancer. We welcome back Stephen Sundquist, who's the executive director of 3CPN. And finally, we welcome Martine Elias. And I would like to read you a
want to welcome three of my colleagues to share in this next
Chad,
session.
I'm going to say that there's a terrible echo here. Thank you. And Martine, I'd like to welcome Martine Elias, who's going to join the session with us. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information on Martine. Following a career in clinical research in the pharmaceutical industry, Martine is now the executive director at Myeloma Canada, the only patient-driven grassroots organization bringing the Canadian myeloma community together to promote a strong, unified national voice for people living with multiple myeloma. Martine also serves on the International Myeloma Foundation Board of Directors, as well as on the Myeloma Patient Europe Community Advisory Board. Together, Barry, Martine, and Stephen, with expert colleagues who are not joining us today, created the vision and mission for a very unique organization we're excited to introduce to our community today. They also serve as founding steering committee members for this new organization. So let's get right into it. I want to talk a little bit about something called Patient Approach to Clinical Trials, an organization called PACT. Barry has mentioned it a number of times in his comments throughout the conference. So what exactly is PACT? It is a pan-Canadian not-for-profit organization that was formed to work towards ensuring and supporting the realization of equal and active patient and patient group engagement in cancer clinical trials. As we get into this conversation, we'll share more information about its vision and mission and some of the key things that the organization is doing. But it's important to understand that the genesis of PACT came, in fact, from the conferences, the last 5 years of conferences, building from a lot of the expert learning, the conversation, the dialogue that happened across the community and inside these conferences. We really discerned that there was a need to move education to action, and that action required a mechanism for change. And that mechanism for change became essentially what is now called PACT. PACT has always had patient and patient engagement at the core of its vision and mandate. And because of this, we have stretched PACT to be very inclusive across the entire pan-cancer community. It's really an ecosystem collaborative. So when we talk about why PACT was created, I'm sorry, I'm just going to, Chad, if you could help me advance the slide here. There we go. The why for PACT was really to create cancer clinical trials that were directly and fully aligned with patient needs. This has been the theme of the conferences for the past 5 years. And the how behind that is that we actually unified the Canadian cancer community to provide collaborative, dynamic frameworks, best practices, and resources for patient and patient group engagement in cancer clinical trials. There's a lot of things in these two statements that we're going to break down, and this is why we've got Barry, Martine, and Stephen together with us to have a dialogue more about the vision and mission impact, as well as some of the important goals that the organization is working towards. So I'd like to first ask Barry to share some of his thoughts on PACT's vision and mission, and we'll continue the conversation from there. Barry.
Thanks, Anne-Marie, and thanks for that great introduction about what PACT is. Um, Interestingly enough, I think a lot of the people who are with us today and who have attended the conferences over the past 5 years actually helped in the development of PACT without even knowing it, as we created the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative model, demonstrating where patients and patient groups could play a role in the ideation of clinical trials all the way through the clinical trial continuum and so forth to bring back patient preferences and values, ultimately through real world data to health technology assessment bodies, for example. But really, when we break it down, what we envision is not just to increase patient centricity in clinical trials. It's true, and to increase awareness in education and access to clinical trials. Of course, those are fundamentals to the vision. But really, we view ourselves as an organization completely dedicated to patient centricity. So there's no other goals other than patient centricity. All our organizations, whether it be Colorectal Cancer Canada, Myeloma, the clinical trial networks, 3CTN, CCTG, etc., pharma organizations and companies and so forth, all have as a goal patient centricity, but that's not their sole purpose. And the sole purpose of PACT is patient centricity. So I think that is really a fundamental difference. And what we want to do is we want to bring people together in a vision, who have people who have the same vision in different aspects of clinical trials, like we heard in today's conference, but still from different areas, but bring them together to collaborate to ensure that these clinical trials actually do meet the needs of patients from the very outset. So I think I'll leave it with that and go on to my colleagues to see what they have to say.
Stephen, would you like to comment on vision and mission at this stage and why 3CTN is at the table?
Absolutely. Thanks, Anne-Marie, and it's a great introduction that you've provided and Barry provided to the work and what's led us to the present point. For the Canadian Cancer Trials Network, 3CTN, a little bit about us, if you don't already know. We represent the clinical trial units. I know in Jason's, in the last session, noted his experience with Ottawa. 3CTN is made up of the network of the majority of cancer trial centers, trial units at cancer centers across the country. And as such, we're dedicated to the efficient, widespread access to clinical trials for all Canadians. And one of our network's cornerstones is in our main priorities and goals have been to advance patient partnership and patient engagement in trials, in the conduct of trials specifically for 3CTN. So the mission of PACT is directly aligned with the work that we strive to do, our membership strives to do locally at cancer centers and then across the country, and ensuring that patients are at the table in designing and developing trials and conducting those trials specifically for 3CTN in a way that considers the patient priorities and preferences up front and throughout the trial life cycle. So it's highly aligned, and it was a pleasure to be able to also harness the collective voice that patient groups uniquely can provide. And I know Martine could speak to that specifically and probably will. But yes. It's an untapped potential prior to PACT to really mobilize the collective patient voice. So we're excited to be able to be a part of it for those reasons.
Thank you. Martine, I'll ask you the same question. As we look at the vision and mission, why is your organization behind this?
That's a great question. And it's something that to me was very natural to do. I remember when I was working in the pharmaceutical industry, I was very much involved in getting the patient voice and working with stakeholder relations. And this was probably over 10 years ago, I would say 12, 15 years ago. I went down to the head office of the company I was working at the time, because I wanted to see how they included the patient's perspective in the design of clinical trial, because I thought it was really important to do. And I went down and talked to the head of oncology clinical trial development, and I asked him, like, how do you include patient voice, and what can we do to make sure that the patient perspective is considered when we design clinical trial? He looked at me and he said, ha, don't worry, we do this. And I went, wow, this is great. So, well, how do you do this? Like, I want to learn more. He said, well, I talk to the doctors and they tell me what patients want. And so when I heard that, my arms just went flop, and I realized like how much I needed to change the system and bring the patient voice to the design and clinical trial. So that's why I got involved, because I'm very passionate about this, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And this committee and the work that Barry had done was just the right time, the right thing at the right time for me.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. There's so much language around patient centricity, patients at the center, et cetera, et cetera. One of the wonderful things that this conference has brought to the table is a conversation around what that really means. And as part of PACT, developed with the community, developed over the 5 years of conversations with the community, PACT has actually developed a Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials Stakeholder Charter. And I want to talk now a little bit more about what this charter is and some of the tenets of that charter. So, Martine, I'm actually going to well, Barry, let me start with you. Let's start with tenet number one, which is making patient centricity a norm in clinical trials. What exactly does that mean, and what do we want to express with that tenet?
Sure. I'll deal with that, but I just want to thank everybody who participated over a period of essentially 4 to 5 years on developing the stakeholder charter. And it was based on various patient declarations that we saw to include the patient voice. But really, this charter that was developed really helps to govern the relationship between a trial sponsor and a patient group and patients. And in the process of developing these 5 tenets, which are fully explained in the charter in depth, and certainly we can make that available to everybody. It's on the colorectal cancer site as well as on the PACT Canada, PACT Canada.org site. You can see the breadth of it in the full charter. But these 5 points really articulate the fundamental or founding principles upon which the work that PACT is doing now and will do going forward. And of course, central to it is that patient centricity shouldn't be a question; it should be the norm in clinical trials. And when we talk about patient centricity, we often hear the word, "Oh, we consult with patients," and to Martine's point, where they consulted it earlier on just with the physicians and not with the patients. But now they say they consult with the patients. But that's not true patient engagement or patient group engagement. And in order to establish it as a norm, we also need the institutional memory of patient groups, so that whatever is started in the ideation and by patients who are engaged in developing a clinical trial, ideating a clinical trial, and so forth, that the patient group is there to support it and ensure that we can sustain this over a period of time, this centricity in clinical trials. And even today, we could say even post-clinical trials. So there's that pre-clinical trial ideation, during the clinical trial, and the post-clinical trial to keep that relationship with patients and ensure some of these other tenets are fulfilled. But essentially, centricity is a norm, and I think that we want to make centricity the norm. And I think that most of trial sponsors, both academic and pharma, want to do it, but don't always know how to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Stephen, I'd like you to comment on the tenants who are very much part of the development of the charter. I know that there's things that are important to you. Can you highlight a couple of things that you see as being critical for the support behind the charter?
Thanks, Emery. I should comment that I bring the royal we to me, which is the 275 plus or minus clinical research professionals, investigators, and patient partners that make up our network. So that tenet two, if we look at supporting education, training, and development of patient group members, for an organization like ours, we've had patient PPI, patient engagement and partnership embedded within our committee structure, our governance structure at our site levels for over 8 years now. But there is a lot of work to be done to, as Barry noted in the first tenet, make patient centricity a norm everywhere. And I think it only happens in Canada, and it happens best when we collaborate with a platform like PACT and an organization like PACT that provides a structure for continuing to engage patient groups. There's patient partners. We see their interest and their engagement come and go depending on their availability. So accessing a broader group and with a structure like PACT for partnering with patient groups ourselves is really essential to our strategy and our futures. So we're developing, for example, patient partner education curricula so that patient partners can be more comfortable speaking about trials and speaking with investigators. We're collaborating with others who have developed courses, but we want to recognize that progression, and we want to consult and ensure, shouldn't use the word consult, we want to make sure our patient partners are at the table developing that curriculum and describing for us, for example, what they are looking for, and who better than patient groups and the collective of patient groups and the structure afforded by PACT to allow us to continue that work.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Martine, I'll ask you the same question. What's important to you about this charter? What are the things you'd like to highlight about it?
Well, education to me is really key. Patients are not, they don't learn to be patient. They don't go to school to be a patient. They become patient because, unfortunately they develop a disease. It could be cancer or something else. And in your day-to-day work, like, I'm going to take Barry as an example. He was trained as a lawyer. He wasn't trained as a clinical researcher, but he had to learn about clinical research because if I remember correctly, Barry, clinical research is what really saved your life. And so you got involved by learning about it. And it's not just, learning how to design a clinical trial, but it's learning how to be a patient and provide the right input in answering a questions, because that's what trials are for. They're testing a hypothesis. So, the patient's perspective is really critical in, designing a clinical trial program that is going to make sense. And, this is what the tenants are there to support this kind of work, and why we need to do this, and why it is important. Can't advocate for something if you don't learn about it. So, education is really key. And taking away the whole stigmatism around, clinical trials. Well, it's, you're going to be part of a guinea pig program, or, you're not going to get standard of care treatment. So there's a lot of myths that we have to debunk first, and then get the patient where they can provide valuable input.
If I can add to Martine's point, I think you've touched on something really important, and that there is a long way to go as far as engaging patients in trials generally, and the public, informing the public. And patient groups, maybe segueing to the third tenet, as equal and independent partners in that collaboration, are the best organizations and to be able to connect with patients and oncologists and caregivers in a different way than researchers can. And this could be a significant way to change what has been a rate of trial involvement in Canada and North America, for that part, of around 5% of cancer patients involved in being involved in trials. And that's arguably, or I think we can agree, a very low number. So there's a lot of work to be done that patient groups could play and should play a significant role in transforming the success of trials and how well we do trials, and maximizing the benefit and accelerating the conduct of trials.
Thank you for reinforcing that point, Stephen, because I think it's a wonderful bridge to, the work that PACT is doing and taking a lot of amazing conversation and dialogue into action. And Barry, I wanted to ask you now to talk about the work of PACT and the many initiatives that have been underway for some time now.
Sure, and I might add that some of the work that we're doing, just to segue off what Stephen was saying, is, for example, to ensure that there's more patient centricity and representation. Our work in equity, diversity, and inclusion in clinical trials that's ongoing right now. So a little bit, as I mentioned before, the tenets that you saw on the slide before really are the foundation of the work that we do in everything that we do. Yesterday, for example, we heard from Kadith about the need for more transparency in clinical trials, exposing the gaps up front so that we could get over those hurdles more quickly. And as you noted, one of our tenets dealt with transparency and so forth in clinical trials. A couple of things that we're working on right now, for example, in terms of access to clinical trials, is working together with a small group who are just beginning themselves, both at QCRO, at Catalyst, and in Windsor, Ontario, and a little bit in New Brunswick, bringing together people who help patients and researchers find the trials, match the patient with the trials, and we call those clinical trial navigators. So not the clinicaltrials.gov site, for example, that we heard today, or the different sites that OncoQuebec, for example, has. Those are tools, but the actual people, bringing them together in a community of practice so they could share what they do in order to help patients find trials more easily and ultimately speak to their physicians about those trials that are put together and match them into a trial. So that's one example of the work that we're carrying out. Another example would be our work in health technology assessment and ensuring that the patient voice is heard and developing health policy in these areas with respect to clinical trials. You heard a little bit about decentralized trials, and 3CTN has developed the CRAFT model. So the idea of using, as Craig Lipset was speaking to today in his keynote speech, about advancing policy so that we do have decentralized trials. That's another example. And you can see we started off initially basing it on the Duke University and FDA Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative and set up that model. You may recall yesterday from the keynote speaker, Jan Geisler, showed a slide from Patty and from his work at WECAN, at Advocates, that in Europe, they had something very similar to our model in terms of when and where you can include that patient group along the pathway. And the charter we already spoke to, so I'm not going to come back to that because that is the sort of underscoring principle. But getting trial sponsors and getting academics to actually accept that charter and abide by that charter, by those tenets, is another story. It's quite challenging to get them to do it. And in a recent call with a major pharmaceutical company, one of the top ones, they always talked about consulting the patient or consulting a group, not really working in co-creation, for example. And those are some of the things that we're doing. Certainly, we'll be doing a lot of work in awareness and education along that and collaborating with, and that's the point, bringing people together, not necessarily to reinvent or redo what other people have done, but bring people like 3CTN, CCTG, and patient groups, etc., together in order to share in that experience and work together and build that community in partnership.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Barry. Is it okay if I add to Barry's example?
Of course.
Barry,
Of course.
Yeah, you're just very excited by what you said. I think acknowledging the work of PACT and the structure that was provided as a guiding beacon for how we developed at 3CTN, the colorectal cancer trial map that's in one of the booths. It actually has a link to the trial navigator within that service for patients in finding, or researchers or oncologists in finding all of the trials that are active across the country and linking to clinicaltrials.gov information. But that navigator piece is, and the validity that comes with that support that PACT provides in developing that and understanding that patient voice has been embedded within the development is tremendously validating and provides assurance for us as we're developing initiatives that we are capturing a broader patient voice in the work that we're doing.
And
Thank you.
It's a great example, Stephen, and I actually went to it this afternoon. So, a call out to everybody to go to the exhibition hall, virtual lobby as well, and go into. You just click on those booths, and you'll see the videos and so forth in each of those booths, and in there you'll see that great explanation video of the, in this case, it was clinical trials, but there were for colon cancer patients, but there was other ones as well, and great representation in the 3C.
I wanted to loop back on this idea of PACT as a unifier, a consolidator. In other words, we're really welcoming community. We are bringing in the expertise that others have. If the three of you could really talk about how that looks and who we really would like to join us, in what way they can join us, what are the ways in which the community can start to engage with PACT?
Who are you asking? Go ahead, Martine.
Anybody that's passionate about the patient voice and wanting to bring more and better and more representative clinical trials to patient is welcome to join us. I mean, Barry, you would, our steering committee would take anyone who's passionate and wants to learn and wants to roll up their sleeve, because there's a lot of work to be done. I would think we have come a long way. But we still have a long way to go. I'll just give one example where I thought, a company had really, really taken at heart patient co-creation. They were developing a clinical trial, and part of the clinical trial, they had to have a wearable for patient to measure side effects, and they were looking at 3 different vendors for that particular wearable. And they invited patients, myself included, myeloma patients, to the table, to the pitch of the presentations from the 3 companies that wanted to sell them this wearable. And we were part of the decision making in deciding which one was the best. And so that, to me, was really bringing the patient voice to the table and in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great example.
So whether you're a patient group, industry, pharma, CRO, whether you're involved in health policy, government agency, all welcome, to the point of ensuring that we do have this centricity enshrined in everything we do in clinical trials in Canada.
Yeah. I think adding to the points, I would say maybe my pitch statement would be, PACT provides this suite of best practices and an informed, I want to say, we're averse to frameworks, but it is an informed framework that, and a comprehensive one, that can really help organizations that Barry mentioned accelerate their patient engagement. I see PACT as at this stage in its maturity, as a capable of accelerating patient centricity and patient partnership initiatives. So reaching out to PACT and getting PACT support would be a well-informed way and a best practice way of getting that work going and doing it right.
Yeah. Thank you. And I want to reinforce that as a unifier and a consolidator, PACT is very appreciative and knowledgeable about a lot of the work that already exists. And we want to join forces with many of the organizations who are already doing some amazing work in this space. So Barry, just in closing, I'd like to give you the final remarks on just, what are your hopes and dreams a little bit for PACT in the next 2 years or so? Where do you see us making our biggest impact?
So I think it's a lot about consolidation of what we're doing based on those principles and acting upon new initiatives in those areas, both in Canada and taking advantage of some of our collaborators globally in Europe, etc., bringing in experts from health technology assessment international, for example, understanding how patient preferences can be gathered early on, working with real world evidence frameworks being developed in clinical trials. These are some of the things that we're thinking about right now and starting to act upon, and really understand that this is a very dynamic organization. PACT. It's not something that is stuck in a specific framework, but it is guided by those 5 tenets. So the vision really is to ultimately is to improve access, of course, to patients, to clinical trials that meet their needs, and ensure in Canada, from a health policy point of view, that we have a rich environment in life sciences, so that that we have plenty of clinical trials available, and so that patients can even benefit from these new technologies that are initiated through clinical trials that they otherwise wouldn't have had in Canada if they didn't have these clinical trials here. So that, I guess, is a bit of a plug on the health policy side. We need more clinical trials in Canada. We need more access, but they also have to be patient-centered trials and meet the needs of the patient and the population.
Thank you. And the wrap up, what's the website, Barry? There's a number of people asking.
Sure, it's pactcanada.org, PACT, Canada.org.
Right.
.org.
PACTcanada.org for the questions that have come through. And we'll have to leave it at that. Please reach out if you're interested in understanding more about PACT and joining forces with the organization. That wraps up day 2